groves, and saboteurs. Please join me in welcoming Ryan Lowry.
All right, can everyone hear me okay? That's my first question.
Yes.
All right, so welcome tonight. Ooh, and it's getting a little bit romantic in here. I'm liking it already. So, yeah, that's it. Yeah, that's perfect. So, okay, well, welcome to U-Boats, Saboteurs, and Orange Groves. We are going to learn a lot about the state of Florida in World War II. I have a couple of extra things I'm going to present here tonight. When it comes to history, I always feel like I'm learning something new every single time I research a topic. And with this topic in particular, it feels like I always find something new. So I hope the new material that I found tonight, and I really hope that this material that I share with you tonight is really going to be interesting to you as it was to me. So I'm going to share that as we go along our presentation. And, you know, if we look at the Second World War for what it was, we always think about the big events. We think about D-Day. We think about the Battle of the Bulge, Iwo Jima, Guadalcanal. This is a completely different story. We're talking about the story of the home front. What was happening back here at home with ordinary Americans like yourself and I. Florida paid quite a price during World War II. We lost 4,600 Floridians overseas during World War II. Quite a price. So back here on the home front, we played an enormous role, and you're going to be learning about that tonight. And the first bit of importance to why Florida was so immensely strategic in America's fight against Nazism will be evident here on the map. So just take a look at this map here of the United States and the Caribbean. I'm going to see if I can get maybe my laser pointer, maybe not. But what is the one part of the United States that is jutting out like a sore thumb? Us, right? So we are sticking out like a sore thumb. This geographic feature in the United States alone is going to be a very important factor in how we are going to defend the United States. There was a lot, oh, there we go. There was a lot going on Florida's coast here on both sides in the Gulf of Mexico and out into the Atlantic. You can see why just by the way the state is formed, how important it's going to be to defend key places like maybe the Panama Canal, the interior of the Gulf of Mexico where we have a lot of shipping going on. This is almost going to be like a fortress for this very vulnerable part here of the home front. Texas, Louisiana, you see Mississippi over here. Florida is going to be sort of this barrier geographically. We're going to be immensely important here. There's a lot of history out in the water today if you get a chance to dive out there, but we'll dive into that topic a little bit later. But for now, we're going to step a little bit back into time. Let's rewind almost 100 years ago. We're going to go back to pre-war Florida. What was going on before the war even started? I think that's probably the most appropriate place to start to begin our story. Florida was a very, very quiet place back then. You didn't have a lot of big bustling cities, no tall buildings or anything like that. You had little towns. You had a lot of agriculture. People generally like to come here on vacation to go to Daytona Beach, which at that time was just a little teeny tiny town. You had Daytona, you had Seabreeze, and then you had Daytona Beach. They weren't even all formed yet into what is known as Daytona Beach. So this is a very sleepy place to go. It was mostly a vacation hub, so that's what people did. Rural and agricultural. That was the story for our state. We had a meager population of about 1.4 million people here. It was nothing like it'll be during World War II. And that's the big role it's going to play. It's really going to grow the state. At this time, people are just enjoying their vacations down here. This is a picture of Amelia Earhart with her Lockheed Electra. Right before she took off on her maiden voyage, she would actually take off from Miami, Florida, before she began her trip around the world. Just not to get off topic, one of the most amazing World War II veteran stories I ever heard was about Amelia Earhart. After she took off on her maiden voyage, she disappeared, of course. This veteran I talked to had been in the Pacific Campaign at Tarawa, Saipan, Tinian, and Okinawa. He had been through some battles. And on Saipan, when he was there, he actually remembered going on Saipan with a friend of his that was an intelligence officer. And this intelligence officer was interrogating Koreans in a jail cell in a town called Garapan. And this friend of his turned around and said, "Bartos, they're telling me Amelia Earhart was here." And he remembered seeing these gentlemen in overalls with splotches of black paint all over these overalls, not Marine Corps regulation at all. And they were carrying out a suitcase that had AE in gold letters on the side of it. I'll never forget that story. But it makes you wonder what really happened to one of aviation's greatest pioneers, Amelia Earhart. But she actually took off from Miami, Florida for her final voyage. But by and large, Florida was a very sleepy place. The pre-war economy is going to play a huge role in what's going to come here. We have 2 hurricanes that hit the state of Florida. There had been a period of prosperity, and then 2 hurricanes came in and destroyed the southern part of the state. And this, to investors, did not look good. So a lot of these people who were investing in land began to pull out, and they decided that they did not want to stay here. So they began to pull out, and the economy began to collapse. Florida actually had an economic depression before the Wall Street crash in 1929. So in 1927, most Floridians were actually living in poverty before this national catastrophe even began. So Floridians were actually used to poverty before everybody else was. So I think, in retrospect, we were actually a little bit more prepared than the rest of the country for what was to come economically. This is a nice postcard that I found over here, known as Cigar City over here in Tampa, Florida. Unemployment's skyrocketed. Nobody was hiring, just like you would see in the Great Depression. Florida was in really big trouble. There really didn't seem to be a way to come out of it. And for the latter half of the 1920s into the 1930s, this unemployment continued until Franklin Roosevelt enacted what was known as the New Deal. This was an economic spurt, if you will, to try to get the economy back on its feet after the Wall Street crash of 1929. However, Florida was a very unique exception. Florida actually did not experience the level of growth that originally was hoped in this wonderful New Deal. There was a little bit of impact regarding this New Deal. The Civilian Conservation Corps was very active during this time. They actually helped plant 13 million trees during this New Deal and built federal buildings and schools. So there was some initiative to pull Florida out of this economic depression, but it was not enough to really get Florida out of this bind that it was in. There was still, I believe it was 1 out of 4 people were still living on government reliance. The United States needed more. And on the home front, at this very same time that people are going through this deplorable poverty, people were looking overseas and they're reading their newspapers and they're looking at what's going on. They're hearing about this man named Adolf Hitler in Europe who's seemingly unstoppable. And he's going across the globe. He's taken Czechoslovakia, he's taken Austria, and he's marched into Poland in 1939, and Europe is completely at war. And a lot of people began to ask themselves here in Florida, are we going to eventually be involved in this? There was 2 factions of people that lived on the home front. It was the people that wanted to help the Allies, Great Britain and Russia. And there were people like the American Firsters who wanted to stay out of the war. They believed that they believed that supplying this military-industrial complex, as it would later be called, was a bad idea. So, in turn, these 2 factions were the dominant groups of thinking in the United States at this time. I think a lot of people were starting to understand that we were going to get into this war at some point, although nobody wanted war. It was eventually going to come, but in hindsight 2020, no one really foresaw what was going to happen to us on December 7th, 1941 at Pearl Harbor. If you are familiar with St. Augustine, this is actually a picture I found on the National Park Service website. This is Castillos de San Marcos. You actually see Navy sailors just walking around and enjoying themselves. This would actually be where the entrance is into the fort. And this picture is really, really special. I wanted to include it for a very good reason. Because at the very same time this picture was taken, there are battleships and cruisers and destroyers burning in Pearl Harbor when this picture was taken. This was taken on December 7th, 1941, and it was saved. So right now it's currently in their collection. So Japan sneaks 6 aircraft carriers and bombs Pearl Harbor in Hawaii. And officially, we are in the war in the Pacific. And several days later, Hitler says to himself, Japan has not lost a war in 3,000 years. We can't lose now. So he declares war on the United States. And a lot of his generals are thinking, what are you doing? What are you doing? You've got to be kidding me. We're going to lose now. We were already bogged down in Russia. There is no way we're going to win against the United States. And there were a lot of people in Germany that realized this pretty quickly. But within only a few days, the United States, which had an army roughly the size of Romania's, was now at war with 2 large powers who were on a war of territorial expansion in Asia and in Europe. So now, what was the United States going to do about that? Well, here in Florida in particular, the first thing people do is panic. Typical, right? So people do panic. There are blackouts. So back then, you used to be able to buy light bulbs that actually were covered in this black coating. It was almost like a paint. And you used to be able to take out your regular light bulbs and stick this in, screw it in. So enemy submarines would not see you off, actually be able to see the coast and be able to engage the ships that were heading off to England. Everybody was afraid of invasion. That was the biggest concern. One of the biggest questions that I get when talking about could the Axis have done it, I don't think so. Were those fears founded? I don't really think so. The Atlantic was too big and the Pacific was too big. Japan just wanted to end the war quickly. But the main fear, and this, I think after reading so many articles in newspapers, I think this was a propaganda fear spurred on to get people involved in the war effort, to buy bonds, to get out there and produce these materials of war so we could win it and end it. But on December 7th, 1941, the world is going to change forever, and the United States is never going to be the same after this day. And even today, we're still living with the repercussions of what Japan did that day. The United States is going to become a global superpower after that. Blackouts become mandatory. If you remember a couple years ago when we all went into quarantine, that's a little bit about what it was like. People were very, very afraid. This was a very scary time to be an American, and being in Florida, it was really no exception either. So the first thing that the United States does is mobilize for war. We go from having a military the size of Romania's to eventually having millions and millions of Americans joining the armed forces. They joined the Marine Corps, which was needing recruits bad. People were joining the Army. They were joining the Army Air Corps, the Navy Air Corps. They were joining the Coast Guard. Every branch of service was swelling with people. The lines were wrapped all the way around these recruiting centers. Everybody wanted to be a part of this. Some people were actually devastated because they couldn't go with friends of theirs, and they just couldn't go at all because they were either colorblind or they had a physical difficulty of some sort. And it was a really big deal. Joining the service at that time was, in my mind, it's a little bit different than today. Everybody wanted to get a part of it. This picture is also what I think was really interesting was in also Castillos de San Marcos, the fort in St. Augustine. St. Augustine would actually be a major base for the U.S. Coast Guard during World War II. And they're actually having a graduation ceremony right in the middle of the square, you know, where they have all the grass and everything. And this is actually one of the entrances to the display that they have. I think it has all the beds and everything, if I can remember, for anybody that's been there recently. But this is where they would host their graduation. Who's ever been to Flagler College? Anybody? Okay, so that was actually used as a barracks during World War II for Coast Guard personnel. So literally, the whole world became about war. Everything in the United States became about war. That's anything everybody talked about. It was always about the war. How do we get involved? How do we end this thing? How do we get back at Japan for what they did on December 7th, 1941? And a lot of the answer to that was joining the service. One of the first things that happened too was the U.S. military looked at the map of the state of Florida and they said, wow, this could really be used for a military purpose. There's tons of land here. And it's surrounded by water on 3 sides, on the east, west, and the south, and also up in the panhandle. We can use this for some really interesting stuff. We're going to set up bases all around the state of Florida and start moving people in to get them out overseas and get them where do they need to do. So 2 things start to happen. They start building airfields. They start building bases for amphibious training. Florida's perfect for that. We're going to need a lot of Marines going to the Pacific to take on Japan in that island hopping campaign. So a lot of bases are going to be start to built that way and to serve that purpose, specifically for that purpose. You're going to get a lot of different specialized units for amphibious assaults. You're going to have people training as scouts. And Florida is going to offer one of the most hospitable climates to train. It's really going to toughen these boys to go and do what they need to do overseas. It becomes one of the busiest places in the entire United States. Camp Blanding becomes the 4th largest city in Florida. It holds up to 55,000 men at a time. And roughly about 1 million servicemen are going to pass through before 1945 concludes. But there's something about this picture I always liked. So, while everyone's joining the service, another part of Florida life really begins to emerge. It's agriculture. So, as you know, we are pretty famous for our oranges, and we become even more famous for our oranges during World War II. When the U.S. Army, Navy, and Marine Corps go into the Pacific, they find a really particular problem, and that's scurvy, lack of vitamin C, right? Florida's going to really help out with that. We have a large agriculture for oranges, and it's going to be here that orange production actually exceeds that of California's, if you can believe that. So, don't look at that one. But vitamin C is such an important part of somebody's diet, especially when you're in the tropics. It's hot, there's no access to regular food, and you have to keep those vitamins and minerals going when you're in the jungle environments that the Solomon Islands and the Gilbert Islands and all these places in the Pacific offer, right? These horrible places. And vitamin C is really gonna take care of that problem. It really probably saved a lot of people's lives too. They started canning this stuff and sending it all over the world once they learned how to make, once they started to make condensed oranges and dehydrating them. So they canned them up and sent them all over the world. We played a huge role in the vitamin C output to our armed forces. The other major part of the Florida economy that takes off is the war production. With all this land, there's plenty of room to put factories in. We become one of the largest states for shipbuilding companies in the entire United States. I believe we actually have 5 major locations. Tampa, Orlando, Jacksonville, one in the Keys, and one other somewhere else. But we start producing ships. We start producing all sorts of boats. We actually have so much war production for tanks, ammunition, artillery, that the nickname, the Sunshine State, is almost changed to the Steel State because of how much is being produced here in the state of Florida. It's really crazy to think we almost became the steel state. And I don't think it would really fit well now, does it? No, those factories are long closed. But it's at this time that Florida does that switch I was talking about. It's right here. Because you have all these servicemen and women coming in, you have all of these workers coming to Florida that have never been to the state before. You have all these people coming into work and do their part. And they start working in the factories, and they start settling in places like Daytona Beach or Tampa. And these towns become cities, and they start to get bigger and bigger and bigger. And the economy starts to recover where it had been in this long economic slump that the New Deal could not just bring the state of Florida out of it. Now, with the war production in full force, now it was starting to see a recovery. People were starting to have jobs again. There was actually hope was actually starting to emerge for the ordinary Floridian. One of the biggest problems off of our state was the ships that were heading off to England to help out the British, and some were going to Russia to help the war effort over there. These ships were part of the Lend-Lease Act. These ships were carrying ammunition, oil, all sorts of vital materials, even food, to keep England alive during the worst parts of World War II. England was really surviving off of us. If you look at the facts, they were really depending on the United States to get into this war, and it was scenes like this that prompted us to really want to start to get into it in the first place, because we had merchant marines on these ships. These were Americans heading to England to do their job, and they were getting torpedoed. One of the biggest tragedies of these losses of lives with ships was the SS Gulf America, which is actually sunk off of Jacksonville, about 4 miles off the beach. It was traveling at night, and a German U-boat sailed up to the coast of Florida and torpedoed it, and he wanted to make sure that the ship was actually sinking. About 19 of the 48 crew members lost their lives that night. And when the German submarine surfaced, he popped his deck gun up, and he saw people on the beach watching this inferno engulf the SS America. And the subcommander did the decent thing. He saw the civilians on the beach, and he dropped the submarine, went around, and sat in between the beach and the ship to hit the rest of the ship and sink it, to not hit the civilians. So there was moments like that in war that, it wasn't all bloodthirsty. There were decent individuals in war. There really were. There were these decent moments like this, and that was an example of them. There was a telegram that I thought was really interesting that I found. It's actually part of the state archives of Florida. And this was a telegram from Phil May to General Albert H. Blanding, and he sent this in 1942. He said, 2 American ships were destroyed off the coast opposite Jacksonville Beach Friday night. It is reasonable to assume the submarine was aided by the lights of the amusement concessions. That's another name for the amusement park. Is it not desirable to protect ships using this vital lane from danger? Question mark. Yeah. Yeah, I would say so. This question to General Albert H. Blanding prompted a complete change in strategy. So at that time, there were people that took it upon themselves to black out their own lights and black out the curtains as to not create too much light on the coast for these German U-boats to be able to see the silhouettes of these ships moving to England and off into the Atlantic. Now it was mandatory. This was strictly enforced. It was enforced so that the civilians who were acting as part of the military were actually going up and making sure that people's blackout was fully in effect on the coast of Florida. Those were those black light bulbs I told you about. But that was the closest sinking that we had. This effort to sink Allied warships going to England from the United States was part of what was known as Operation Drumbeat. This was the ultimate plan to get rid of Allied shipping off the United States and sever this lifeline. It didn't work as well as we began to win the War of the Atlantic in 1944. We actually had a really interesting episode happen in the Florida Keys in 1942. So when we were short of pilots and aircraft early in the war, we were using blimps to patrol the entire Florida coast. And one of those blimps was known as K-74. And it was patrolling off the Florida Keys when it noticed a German submarine actually pop up and start moving towards Allied shipping. The commander of K-74 was ordered to radio in to the U.S. Coast Guard saying, there's a German submarine in the area. This commander did the opposite of that. He said, we're actually going to go after them. And all they had was a .50 caliber machine gun on a blimp. And so what happened was this blimp goes after this German U-boat that has this massive deck gun on it, and they actually get into a full-on duel off the Keys. And this duel goes on for some time, but of course the weaponry is going to win the battle, right? You're going to have superior weaponry on the U-boat that is going to shoot this blimp down and knock it into the water. They have very sensitive radios on board. There's all of this confidential information. There's code books. So the first thing they do when they touch and hit the water was throw the radios and all the code books into the ocean. That was the first thing they did. And then they started to get into the life rafts. And then eventually, when they got the call for help, and they started to pick them up one by one out of the water, they picked them all up, except for the last guy who was getting out of the water and a shark got him. Yeah, talk about a way to go. But Florida history in World War II it's full of like really interesting moments like this. And I think one of the most interesting was this K-74 story. I really encourage you to look up more of the history. I gave the abridged version, but it's a really interesting tale to tell. Over 400 ships are sunk off Florida during World War II. Some of them are remarkably close. With all of the hurricanes that we've had, there is still stuff that is washing up all along the coast. As you know, we are known as the Treasure Coast for a very good reason. You can still find things washing up from the 1600s, the 1700s. It's no exception with World War II material. I believe somebody found a saber about a couple months ago. Is that right? Mm-hmm. I think so. They posted it all over the internet. But anyways, so there's plenty of history off there. And if you have any kind of diving certifications or anything, you can actually dive some of these wrecks, some of these merchant vessels that had gone down in the Atlantic. So we have so much history just off the beach here. It's insane. So we're having all these U-boats sink all of our merchant fleet being sunk out in the ocean, and none of it's getting to England. So what are we going to do? What can the civilians do about this? So this lovely invention called the Mosquito Fleet, the Corsair Navy, or my favorite is the Hooligan Navy, becomes a real thing. So these are actually volunteers, and they commandeer old and retired vessels, any kind of ship they can find, whether it's an old PT boat, it could be a sailboat, anything with an outboard motor or a sail on it, they used it. And their job was to patrol up and all around the coast of Florida and look for enemy submarines, and that was their job. When I said everyone wanted to get in the war, everybody wanted to get into this thing. So this is actually a picture of some men in the Hooligan Navy, and they were successful. Once they found a German U-boat, they were able to report it to the Coast Guard, and the Coast Guard was on their way, and they would send a PBY Catalina aircraft or dive bombers from the airfields, one of the many airfields that we had here, and be able to take care of that German threat. And I think, when you look at it, we had so many airfields and we had so many aircraft by 1944. A lot of the problem from the U-boat threat dissipated by that time because we were so prepared by that. We had learned so much up until 1944 about how to protect our coast that we were able to stave off these kinds of things. But the Mosquito Fleet was very instrumental in protecting the coastline of Florida. The spies. Okay, so has anybody heard of Operation Pistorius? The German spies that came here to America? Okay, so we've heard of the ones that went to New York. Well, we had some land in Florida. So these gentlemen here were known as, these were the Saboteurs, a part of what was known as Operation Pistorius, named after the founder of the first German-American settlement in the United States. And this operation was personally approved by Adolf Hitler himself. The idea was to send these formerly German Americans into the United States, send them back, and then sabotage key infrastructure, railways, dams, bridges, anything that was key to the war effort back at home. So the plan was to land these guys by submarine. One would land in New York, one would land in Florida, and they would eventually meet up afterwards by train. So the ones land in New York, they're not detected. The other group lands here in Florida, and they did something very smart. They landed in bathing suits and their Kriegsmarine German Navy caps. And there was a good reason for this. It looked probably goofy as hell, but there was a good reason for this. They knew that the Americans executed spies. So if they were still wearing their Kriegsmarine caps, they could be tried as POWs and sent to a POW camp. They would not be executed, not be considered spies. But that's why they did that. So this man here, George Dash and Ernest Peter Berger, these are some of the men that are going to give away the whole plot. They were disillusioned from the beginning. So this operation was already bust before it even began. And little by little, these guys are caught after these two go to the FBI and say, I know of this very big plot, I know exactly where they are, and I'm going to lead you to them. And so they're all caught, all of them are executed, the entire Florida group is executed for the exception of these two, which actually were granted a personal pardon from Franklin Roosevelt himself on that one. This was front page news. This wasn't something that just made the back cover of the newspaper. Everybody heard about this. They say, oh no, the Germans are here. They're here trying to bomb the United States. The threat of invasion wasn't real, but saboteurs were certainly a real threat. And this was just proof in the pudding for that. But it was one of the most sensational stories of the entire home front narrative, in my opinion. But yes, these men are executed, and these two are pardoned. But it becomes the center of espionage activity in the United States for the entirety of World War II. It's right here in Florida. Daytona Beach. We did play a role. We were small, but we played a role. Before World War II, Daytona Beach was actually broken into three places. They were three little towns. You had Daytona, Seabreeze, and then Daytona Beach. When the war began and people began settling here, these towns molded into one large Daytona Beach conglomerate. And since we were an active area, we had a lot of servicemen coming in that needed to be trained. They needed places to stay. And we also had that big hospital over here. So anybody that was coming from overseas that was wounded, badly wounded, they could come over to the hospital and have, just recuperate and do what they needed to do. Daytona Beach is mostly known for the training that took place here. Mary Bethune of Mary Bethune-Cookman University, she was actually lobbying President Roosevelt and the First Lady as well, Eleanor Roosevelt, to start some sort of activism with women and to get them into the war, right? Before World War II, women played smaller roles and women wanted to get more involved. So she lobbied to form some sort of military organization to where women could join. They could be radio operators, they could drive jeeps, they could really get in this thing. And so eventually the Women's Army Auxiliary Corps is formed in 1942. And the ranks swell fast. So many women join that the officers are absolutely swamped with these applications, and they can't take any more. And so many women join this, and they play so many big roles. This training center operated for 2 straight years for the Women's Army Auxiliary Corps, which eventually became the Women's Army Corps, known as the WACS. And it was eventually disbanded in 1944 after training was complete, and we began to win World War II. But this is part of our legacy here in Daytona Beach. I did find also some very interesting things about us here as well. So this airfield that's over here, the Daytona Beach Municipal Airport, I found out that there were actually SPD Dauntless Scout dive bombers, the same kind of dive bombers that were at the Battle of Midway. They were actually deployed here, right over at the Daytona Beach Airfield, which was incredible. They parked F-4F and FM-1 Wildcats and all these really, really interesting aircraft over at that airfield. They also had 4 outlying airfields as well, employed at New Smyrna Beach, Ormond Beach, Bunnell, and Spruce Creek. Isn't that interesting? They also had a launch catapult with arresting gear to accommodate basic carrier training for these aircraft to eventually launch off these aircraft carriers. In addition, an air rescue crash boat facility operated from the New Smyrna Yacht Club. Nearly 1,500 officers and men were stationed at the Naval Air Station Daytona Beach at any one time. Before this, I never even knew that. But when World War II ends, eventually the airfield reverts back to its local municipality and becomes the present Daytona Beach International Airport that you know today. So I thought that was a little interesting ad for our Daytona Beach history. German prisoners of war. We had quite a few of them here. A lot of them began to pour in about 1943. A lot of them were from the German Africa Corps, which had been fighting Rommel and George S. Patton in the deserts. And they were actually still wearing their Africa Corps cuff titles on their uniforms when they were coming off the trains into Florida, when they were going to their POW camps. They were fresh off the battlefield. They looked just like this when they were coming off the trains. By and large, they hadn't had a shower. They'd been fed pretty well. And according to the Geneva Convention, all prisoners of war, when they came here to the United States, they had to be treated the same way a regular U.S. civilian would be treated. And so they got the exact same clothing, food, and anything else that a regular civilian would get. But they were still incredibly dirty. They had not had a chance to change out of their uniform from the North African desert. But that would change pretty quickly. They would be given these surplus jackets, and they were spray painted on the back. They would say PW. And these are the ones that they would wear in the camps when they were there. If you go to Camp Blanding, they have a few examples, I think, of some POW artifacts in their museum. If you get a chance to take a look at it, it's pretty fascinating. From what I understand as well, that we also had Japanese POWs here in Florida, which I did not know. Also, another kind of a personal touch to the story of POWs coming here to the United States. I was over in Normandy and Belgium on vacation, and I was touring the battlefields, and I went to Bastogne, which was a key part of the Battle of the Bulge campaign. And there was a museum there, and one of the curators came out, and he said, "You're going to love this if you're from Florida." And there was an Africa Corps cuff title, much like what these guys would wear. And he pulled it out, and there was a letter with it, and it said, "Prisoner of War Camp, Daytona Beach." I thought it was the coolest thing I've ever came across. I love history, I love the artifacts, but that was one of the coolest things I ever stumbled upon. It was not for sale. I tried to get it back. I tried to bring it back. But no, this curator loved it. He loved having it in the museum. But it was a really interesting part of Daytona Beach history that I fell in love with it. And we had so many of these prisoner of war camps that are just sort of off the record. And some of them are still being discovered in these state archives. Like, okay, well, Germans were placed here. It wasn't a big camp or anything, not like Clewiston or anything like that. But, you know, there were camps dotted all around the state of Florida. It was really amazing how many we brought here to our own state. The relationship between the civilians and these prisoners was also something as well. Some of these prisoners would actually escape at night and go out into town and sometimes go get Chinese food. Yes, yeah, I couldn't believe it either. They would go out and make friends with the local community, and they knew who they were. They said, okay, just make sure you're back before dawn, before the guards miss you. Like, I don't think that really happened too often with our soldiers in the Pacific or over in Europe. So their existence here was largely, it was very, very good. And some of them actually fell in love with America when they came here. They did not want to go back to Germany. They knew that if they went back, they would have to go and see what was left of Europe, which was a complete mess by 1945. It was complete ruins. Some of them were in correspondence with their family in Germany, and they knew what they would be going back to, so they decided to make a new life here. Some of them stayed in Florida.
A lot of them got married.
Yeah.
A lot of them got married so they could stay here. Otherwise, they got kicked out of the country by and large.
Now, see, I didn't know that.
Yeah.
That's what makes this fun.
Up at Fort Drum, they have a museum that goes through that. And they used to go into Watertown on Friday and Saturday night to go to the movie theater.
That's so wild. That's so wild. I thought the Chinese restaurant thing was crazy. That's so interesting. But that's just an example. That's just one of the incredible examples of how friendly the people were here with these POWs and how they coexisted. There were some exceptions, though. Florida, as I mentioned, was a pretty inhospitable place. You go out into the sticks, you have all sorts of wildlife out there. Clewiston POW camp was considered by the International Red Cross to be one of the worst Allied prisoner of war camps in the United States. And for a good reason. The environment. The environment was bad. The guards, also, from what I understand, were not as friendly as some of the other prisoner of war camps as well. They did not treat their prisoners as well, to where the prisoners actually revolted at one point. But I think it kind of brings an interesting perspective, because it shows that a lot of these Germans were not aware of how the Nazis were treating Allied prisoners of war in Europe at the same time. So it creates this weird paradigm shift in retrospect. But Clewiston really had a reputation for being the worst. It had the worst food. It had the worst weather. A lot of these POWs were also used for labor. In Florida during World War II, a lot of these young men that would have been working the fields and working in agriculture, they were out in the Pacific, or they were fighting in the deserts of North Africa. They weren't there to work on crops. So we were outsourcing a lot of labor from outside of the country. The Bahamas, Jamaica, Haiti, and German POWs. Them, in particular, I think a lot of them liked to get out of the POW camp so they could work. But they were out there working too, as well, in the under the hot Florida summer. But they were out there working like anybody else. But they were treated very well, and they had a lot of good things to say about by and large, they had a lot of good things to say about their captors. But Clewiston was by far the worst, and it was here in Florida. Florida won a day in Tampa Bay. Tampa got a very dubious reputation. This is about our training here in Florida. We did so much training. We did amphibious training. We did air training. We did airborne training. You name it, we did it. We had combat scouts come to Florida and train in the hostile environment that we have here. We had the Marine Raiders, who would famously defend Bloody Ridge at Guadalcanal and go up New Georgia and fight on later on Iwo Jima. They were going to train on Florida soil. We also had the latest and greatest technology, military technology that was coming down here to help the Marines hit the beach. These alligator landing craft. We had that coming down here and training in the mangrove swamps and hitting the beaches of Daytona and Jacksonville and all sorts of places. The air fatalities, I was not aware until roughly about a year ago about how often this happened. And Florida was really no exception. This happened at airfields all over the place. You're talking about these aircraft with so many instruments involved, and these rookie pilots, just barely out of flight school, getting into one of these aircraft, these accidents happened all the time to where eventually this phrase became a common phrase for training in Tampa. One a day in Tampa Bay. It was practically one aircraft ditching into the water or rolling on its back and crashing on the airfield, or some were coming in for a landing and they didn't know how to do it properly when they were trained to be on an aircraft carrier. Yes, this was a serious problem. We lost a lot of people in training during World War II. But we became one of the largest spaces for training in the United States. Camp Gordon Johnson was a really big training center that we had here in Florida. It hosted the 28th Infantry Division and the 4th Infantry Division, of which the 4th Infantry Division had its D-Day fame later on June 6, 1944. They ended up training there. Camp Gordon Johnson had a very dubious reputation. It was known for its terrible environment with the mosquitoes and the snakes and the spiders. And it was actually, the reputation actually got so bad that Omar Bradley, the principal commander of the American forces on D-Day, would actually comment that whoever settled this camp should be reprimanded or relieved of command. Yes, he said that when he was commanding the 28th Infantry Division when he was down there. Yeah, it was a pretty brutal place. By and large, everybody was sleeping outside. They were doing these forced marches to prepare for ground combat in Europe. That's what they were there to do. And I think with Florida being the way it is, that's why our men, before they went over there, were so tough. Because they had to endure our state. So they did a lot of preparation for the Normandy landings up near Tallahassee. There's actually a really cool plaque right on one of the beaches that actually talks about how that the 4th Infantry Division, the 28th, actually trained at this beach in preparation for June 6, 1944, to invade Western Europe. Still there today. I think, personally, some of the best ways to experience Florida history are to go to museums and see this stuff, because you learn all the little tiny details. Like I said, I'm giving you the very abridged version here. It's in these museums you get to see the artifacts, and you get to see the personal stories, and you get to really delve into Florida history, especially with World War II. But we really become a powerhouse for training for our country. Florida in 1945. So we go through 4 long, brutal years of war. The world is a lot more empty place. A lot of people did not survive World War II. As I mentioned, we had about 4,600 Floridians die in foreign battlefields. We had 7 Congressional Medal of Honor winners from Florida. They served in all branches, Army, Air Corps. We had a gentleman that was just outside of Gainesville, Florida. He got his at the Battle of Okinawa at Sugarloaf Hill. We had another gentleman that was in Italy that got his. We had many, many acts of heroism on account of sacrifice in World War II. But the war ends finally in 1945 on September 2nd when Japan surrenders. And when that happens, this whole country that was once at war, finally it just all stops. It is no longer about war. The economy is not about war. And then pretty soon everyone's going to start coming home. And there's about 12.1 million Americans that have to come home in what is known as Operation Magic Carpet. This was the effort to bring everybody home. And we had a lot of Floridians overseas that were just waiting to come home and just celebrate with their families and loved ones. And a lot of people that had trained in Florida originally before they went off to foreign battlefields, they remembered Florida. They said, wow, for maybe the exception of those in Camp Gordon Johnson, I really like this state. I want to stay here. I really could make this place a home. And that's where the population boom just explodes. The state of Florida economically and its population just grow. You also have all of this foreign labor that came here and worked in these fields, and contributed to the war effort. They stayed as well. Florida really becomes this major state that before really resembled something you would have seen out of the Civil War. Hardly any people living there, maybe just going to the beach. But now it was a full-on state, like you would see in Georgia or Virginia. We were now a full populated part of the Union, right? It went from about 1.4 million to about 4 to 5 million people in 1945 to 1948. So, and then of course you start the story of the 50s and the baby boom, and everyone comes home from the war and starts having children. Then you see an even greater surge of birth. As I mentioned, the state is never the same after World War II. We also had a lot of pilots that were part of the Tuskegee Airmen train here too. And we also had a lot of them stay and lead some of the civil rights initiatives here in the state as well. Women were also given greater opportunities because they had participated in the Women's Army Corps, the Women's Army Air Corps, and they had really done some amazing work here on the home front. And now they had greater opportunities that were never presented before. People now had an equal opportunity and an equal chance, in the words of Roosevelt, to do their best, not only in their own land, but throughout the world. And that's what they came home to do, and that's what they did in Florida in 1945. Florida really begins to see some change. We see NASCAR. Who loves NASCAR? Yeah, everybody does. Sort of, maybe not. No, okay. But we see NASCAR come here to Florida. Bill France Sr., if I can remember correctly, begins NASCAR in 1948, right over here in Daytona Beach. And that, of course, is going to change our area of Florida forever. And it's going to be part of that great economic boom. But as you can see, Florida goes through this major change during the war years. We really played a massive role in the success of the American story in World War II, and we protected some really important parts of our country. And we had a lot of people from the state sacrifice everything they had to make sure that we could maintain these freedoms. But that's our story of World War II. Now, let's look to the present day now. Look at this picture. This was recovered just a few years ago at Vero Beach in 2015. This was this stuff that I'm talking about that is washing up or being dug up on our beaches. If you've been to the beach lately and you have your metal detector, please call somebody if you see this. This is a U.S. Navy rocket that was used for training during World War II, and they recovered it, they dug it out, and they blew it up, and they did what they needed to do with it. So we're still seeing the impacts of the war even today. Florida's orange industry becomes one of the best in the country after it surpassed California. The state's population grew by 46%. That is a huge jump. So, just keep on the lookout for things like that, like I said. But Florida it is never the same after World War II. And I think in my mind it's one of the most important states that served during that time. Just a couple of things. Just published a book as well, Sandspit Assault, The Battle of Enowetok. This story has not been published in 80 years. No one bothered to even write about it, which I was incredibly surprised. But if you're interested in the book, please let me know. It's about the last battle for an atoll in military history. We had a lot of atolls to conquer, but this was the very last one, and it sealed Japan's fate in the Central Pacific. Some of these stories have never been told in any sort of book before. As you know, a lot of the World War II veterans are no longer with us, unfortunately. So some of these stories that are told in here are told for the very first time.
Please join me